Let's talk about the Prelude on Sacred Song Shorts. Hi, I'm Mark Bowditch with Sacred Song Consulting, and this is Sacred Song Shorts, brief conversations about issues that pertain to the mechanics of traditional worship. Today, our conversation will be on the Prelude. Anything we do in life requires some amount of preparation. Before we go to work in the morning, we have a time of preparation, which probably includes bathing, brushing your teeth, eating breakfast, not necessarily in that order, and then getting to work. If we're going to host Thanksgiving meal at our house, there's probably a little bit of preparation. You probably are not going to wake up Thanksgiving morning, watch the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and then think, I wonder what we're going to eat for lunch. Probably you've spent some time preparing for that activity. Jesus, before he began his earthly ministry, spent 40 days in the wilderness preparing himself for that work. So when we start talking about worship, we realize that worship, at least corporate worship, is the most important activity in which a local body of Christ participates weekly. And just like everything else in our life, worship requires preparation. The pastor's got to prepare his sermon, the musicians have to prepare their music. We personally have to prepare ourselves before we come to the church to worship corporately, and that's a whole nother discussion for another video. So just like everything else that we do, worship requires some preparation. And when we gather together corporately, there needs to be a time of corporate preparation before we get into worship. Now, we think about our world, and our lives are busy and chaotic. We've got activities, so many activities we don't know how we can accomplish all of them. We've got responsibilities. We have things that we like to do. I call all of that life activity. I call that secular time. In other words, it's a huge chunk of our week that requires our preparation for a number of very important activities, enjoyable activities. Worship, and in this particular case, corporate worship, is an important time where we set aside a period, an hour, on a Sunday morning. I call that sacred time. Secular time and sacred time. And as we think through that, we recognize that that sacred time, that time of worship, is a very unique time and very different from our secular time. So the prelude then functions, and when it's used properly, it functions as space between that lengthy secular time and that brief sacred time. The prelude helps put a buffer between those two very divergent time periods in our lives. The prelude, when used appropriately, can be designed to eliminate the distractions of secular time. The concerns about family obligations, the concerns about financial obligations, the concerns about health, etc. The prelude can help eliminate those distractions briefly, and at the same time sharpen the focus of the congregation to get their minds ready for the worship that's about to come. Again, it's a buffer between that secular time and that sacred time. When I was a kid, the church that my family attended placed a notice in the bulletin listed right below the title of the prelude. And the statement said, "The prelude is a veil dropped between everyday life and the sanctuary." Now, that may be a little bit of a dated idea. I mean, I did grow up in the 60s, a small child in the 60s, but still in the 60s, and that was a crazy time in the world. But I think it was a very theologically significant statement to make, that the prelude simply wasn't just something that you do in worship, but it had a function in worship. Now, the prelude, and make sure we get this right, the prelude is not worship. It's not a part of worship. It is the preparation for worship. It is the buffer between that secular time and that sacred time. Now, if you don't like the word prelude to describe it, well, then call what this is, what its function is. Call it the preparation for worship or a preparation for worship. If you don't like the word prelude, the important thing is not what you call it, but that you have it, that you use it as that preparation period to help get the congregation to focus away from all of the things in life that distract them, and to instead prepare them to focus solely on the worship of God. In the best practices of traditional worship, the prelude is going to be that focused time. It's going to be a time set aside, not background music, but a time when that music is the only thing going on. So many congregations look at the prelude as, if you will, wallpaper music, going on as the congregation is gathering in the worship space. They're chatting with their neighbors, welcoming guests, etc., etc. And while a lot of people call that prelude, that probably is not the best use of a prelude. If you like that idea of music going on to kind of set the mood in the worship space for the congregation as they gather, that's great. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But don't call that prelude. An option to call that kind of music is gathering music. It's just there in the background to help kind of set the mood of the worship space. Best practices, though. The prelude will be a specific, focused time where there is no other activity going on. That it's a time to focus, not a time to converse. Well, how then do you get a congregation to know this? Well, anything that you want them to know, you're going to have to tell them. And not only are you going to have to tell them what the prelude is, you're going to have to tell them why. So if this is a new idea for you, you're probably going to make an announcement of some kind or a word of instruction before the prelude for several weeks in a row, maybe up to a month or two, reminding the congregation this is why we do a prelude and this is what the prelude is for. Explain to them that we're trying to put a separation between that secular time and that brief sacred time where the congregation gathers together to worship. Explain that to them, and then explain to them what their expected behavior would be. So make sure you tell them this is a time for you to sit silently and let the music help you prepare for worship. You don't want to give them, bad instructions or rely on them to come up with their own set of behaviors. You want to give them what the expected behavior is and remind them of that regularly so that becomes a part of the routine. They know when the prelude begins that they're to be quiet rather than have a conversation with their friend. After that period where you have vocally instructed them what and why a prelude, then perhaps put in the bulletin some kind of a statement or on the screens, hey, the prelude is a time for you to focus. Allow all the distractions of your life to melt away for a brief period and focus. Prepare yourselves for the worship of God. So, what can you put in the bulletin? Well, one great way is to simply put a focus sentence. The prelude is a veil dropped between everyday life and the sanctuary. That's a great focus sentence, and it may work perfectly in your situation. But you could come up with some other focus sentence in the bulletin or on the screen. Maybe a one or two sentence synopsis of what the theme of worship is for that particular day. Another option to consider is to put in a prayer and instruct the congregation as you listen to the prelude. Silently pray this prayer to help you prepare for worship. Certainly, if that prelude is a hymn tune that the congregation knows, well, then provide them with the text of that hymn so that they can focus themselves on what the text of that familiar hymn is and allow that to kind of draw them into the preparation for worship. Well, some of the things to avoid in the prelude could include use of soloist. Being a soloist is really an attention-grabbing kind of act. And you really don't want that for the prelude. You want the prelude to be a bit more nuanced, a bit less obvious. And so the use of a soloist is probably not the best use of the prelude time. By the same token, the children's choir probably should not be singing the prelude. Certainly the children's choir could sing in another part of worship, but the prelude would not be, because the attention of the congregation won't be on preparing themselves for worship. The attention of the congregation are going to be on those kids singing. And so that's probably not the best use of the prelude time. Using piano, using a guitar, using the organ, instruments that are maybe not so attention grabbing are probably going to be better and more effective uses of the prelude. So the music for the prelude, what should it be? Well, first and foremost, the music for the prelude should not be anything that draws undue attention to itself. The prelude should not be something that draws undue attention to itself. The prelude is not the time to show off your technical abilities as a performer, as a musician. It's not the time for you to play a gimmick through the music, like a stinger at the end of the prelude. That really is not the appropriate time, because that immediately draws attention to that technique or that feature, rather than using the music as kind of, if you will, the lens through which we prepare ourselves. You want to think of that prelude, and I'm not meaning to sound mystical or otherworldly about this, but you want the prelude to be something that the congregation will see through. The prelude is going to be something that is going to point them to the object of our worship, which is God. So the music becomes, if you will, a funnel through which the congregation gathers together and then prepares for the worship of God. So in that respect, the prelude has a utilitarian feature. It gives the congregation the opportunity to get ready for worship. Now, the best way for the prelude to be effective is that the music for the prelude fits or amplifies the theme of worship for that day. Johann Sebastian Bach did this a lot with his chorale preludes. And of course, there are arguments about what his chorale preludes were for. Were they preludes like we're talking about here, preparation for worship, or were they introductions to hymns? And we could get into that argument, but we won't. But the important part about what Bach did there was he took familiar tunes and created arrangements of those tunes for organ. Well, the prelude, when used appropriately, can amplify perhaps a hymn that's going to be used in that worship service, or the theme of that worship service, or the focal point of the sermon in that worship service, or the focal point of the lectionary used in worship in that service. The prelude needs to fit, and to be most effective, it needs to fit in a fairly obvious way. Well, these are all kinds of different things we can talk about with the prelude. Best practices on how to use the prelude in worship. And I bet you've got comments you'd like to share with others. So make them in the comments section below. We'll compile all of these and talk about them in a future video. Sacred Song Consulting exists solely to help congregations refine, revitalize, and reform traditional worship for contemporary people. We provide you with resources. We're a guide for you to understand and know what the best practices are for traditional worship. We give you tools on how to prepare, plan, and implement traditional worship, the nuts and bolts ideas about what makes traditional worship work well and how it can be used to engage your congregation in offering their praise to God. We're here to help you. You are not alone in wanting to produce creative and transformative traditional worship for your congregation. Reach out to us. Contact us today and let us know how we can help.